Hello, BookTube. It's the 1st of July, and everyone on BookTube is doing their June wrap-ups and July TBRs, and I want to be in on the fun. I did a July TBR BY, a list of strong recommendations for you for books that are coming out in July that I've already read. But that still leaves the wrap-up part, doesn't it? I read almost 100 books in June of 2018, so that's too much to do in a normal wrap-up. But I thought maybe I could do the same kind of thing as with my TBR BY. I could do a look back at June for a few highlights, things that I really liked and that you might enjoy if they sound good to you. So I made a list that I thought we'd go through right now, starting with a nonfiction book on a subject that I've mentioned on this channel before. It's called The Perfect Weapon by David Sanger. And it is an inquiry not only to the cyber attacks that influenced the 2016 U.S. presidential election, but an inquiry into cyber warfare just in general. The author makes a whole bunch of great points. He's been thinking about this deeply for a long time, you can tell. And as a result, the book is a wonderful jumping-on place, and I also found it furthering my knowledge based on the other books I've read on the subject. It's not easy reading. You will wonder how much of this you are an unwitting accomplice to, but boy is it good. It's a slim book, but boy is it good. The next one is big. It's a big fat biography. It's by Matthew Polly, and it's a biography of Bruce Lee, the martial artist, which if you told me in 2017 that when a new book came out in 2018 about Bruce Lee and you would read it and love it, I would have thought there's very little chance of that, but it's fantastic, just incredible. The author does an amazing amount of original, groundbreaking work, interviewing everyone, sifting through old photos and old newsreels. Just, this will be the starting point for any future biography of Bruce Lee, but the thing is done so engagingly that I really find it hard to believe there'll ever be a real need for another biography of Bruce Lee. And ordinarily, at this point in my little blurb here, I would say if the subject interests you, by all means, you won't be disappointed. But the subject didn't interest me when I first read the book, and I loved it anyway. So if you're in the mood for a really immersive, really snappily written biography, this will do just fine, whether you're interested in Bruce Lee or not. Then I want to talk about a couple of debut novels. I love debut novels, as you all know, and I have a couple that I read in June, that came out in June, that I really liked. The first one is Bearskin by James McLaughlin, about a man with an obviously checkered past who finds the perfect hideaway from the world in rural Virginia, where he is tracking game, he's refurbishing cabins, he's basically a kind of jack of all trades, but all of it off the grid, completely, until he finds a slaughtered bear. And it obviously wasn't killed by animals, it was obviously poached. And then he finds another one. And it starts to look like there's a major problem in literally in his neck of the woods. And he teams up with a specialist, but it becomes obvious as the novel goes on, in fact in quick order, that he has a terrible choice. It becomes obvious that he is not just hiding from the world in rural Virginia. He's also hiding from a specific group of people who want to find him and chop him up into little bits, do to him what someone's doing to the bears. And it becomes obvious that the choice is going to be make a visible enough effort to save these animals, and if you do that, run the risk that you will put yourself on a broader radar that you don't want to be on. And I thought it was remarkable. I mean, it has that kind of a thriller plot to it, but I thought the strongest point about it was the characters. The drawing of the characters I thought it was remarkably done. Can't wait to read something else from this author. And the next one is We Begin Our Ascent by Joe Mungo Reed, about a power couple. The wife is a genetic scientist, a geneticist, and the husband is a member of the middle of the pack of the Tour de France. So he's not the guy you see out in front. He's the huge crowd. He's in the huge crowd of cyclists that you see behind that guy. And they seem to have all the answers. They seem to be keeping lots of plates spinning in the air, but then the writer just has his way with them. It just drags them. He stalls her career. he gets him involved in a doping scandal, and blood doping, like that brought down so many of the stars of the Tour de France, and drags the two of them down into the depths of the demi-monde. And it has such a wonderfully readable prose line that you're on for every page of it. I can't imagine. I loved this book. I'm not at all interested in the Tour de France, but I thought it was fantastic. And I can't imagine what this author will do next. This is a debut this is an author voice, an author presence on the page that strikes me as very unpredictable. This might be one of those delightful authors where you never know what the next book is going to be like, which would be great. I'll be right there for it. The next one is Life in the Garden by Penelope Lively. The novelist Penelope Lively wrote a book about gardening. On the surface, it looks very pat. It looks like just a canned history of recreational and produce gardening, with a few anecdotes of her own thrown in, but it quickly becomes more than that. It's intensely immersive and literary and personal. It's an amazing Penelope Lively memoir in the form of garden writing. I was spellbound the whole time. So, and I never actually did get my own gardening plans launched from the launch pad. They remain only plans. I am now telling myself that I'm going to try a much longer approach, preparing the ground, getting it ready to go over the winter, and then starting fresh next spring on a real garden, a full-length thing. I'll talk to everybody here to see how much ground I can use, whether or not anybody cares. I don't think anybody does. And then I will use as much as I can, and I'll be reaping lots of advice. But I thought, my own gardening plans, I thought, maybe started too late. I felt like I was scrabbling to learn the basics and not knowing what to plant or anything like that, or having a real sense of it. But reading Life in the Garden really made me want to get out there. And also made me want to go back to works of literature that I have on these shelves and read what famous novelists, in addition to famous gardening writers, have said about growing things. Just an amazing book. It's slim and wonderful, even if you've never touched a garden spade in your life. Then the next one is The Collected Stories of Machado de Assis. This is a big new hardcover from Liverite of the great, groundbreaking Brazilian author. This is the very first English language translation of all of his short stories. So there are quite a few stories in this volume that have never been read in English before. And once you get into the swing of his worldview, he's wonderful to read. Smart, very funny, very mordant, and a very Jack Benny-style sense of humor, if any of you are old enough to remember what that means. And a nice, clean, good translation by Margaret Gell Costa and Robin Patterson. I think we saw it in this channel, but then I soaked myself into it. And boy, oh boy. Again, like with the Bruce Lee book, it's a landmark of Machado de Assis in English. So, and a fantastic international reading experience. It's a world that he just evokes in every corner, every street, every kind of person, every regional prejudice. Just it's immersive reading. If you see it at your library, I think the hardcover is probably pricey, but if you're into it, you're gonna love it. And then the next one is very slim. We've seen it on this channel. It's by Rosamund Young, and it's The Secret Life of Cows. No more than 120 pages long. Just her. She oversees a very organic, natural farm and sort of domestic animal preserve, and has come to know cows and pigs and chickens very well. She's come to know them in a way that you get to know them if you see them wandering around, if you see them living a natural life in a pen, fields, places to ramble, no fear of predators, as opposed to a factory setting where they're penned in chain link and stacked on top of each other like cordwood. If you see these, what we call farm animals, in a natural setting where they're not stressed at all, they get to play, they get to have family relationships, they get to associate with each other, they get to determine very largely their own schedule, when they want to go out, when they want to come in. You start to see their personalities right away. Not only the generalities that bond a species together, but also the individuals, what every individual is like, what they like and don't like, which ones are funny, which ones are moody. So the fact that this author reveals that in this book about the cows and chickens and pigs that she lived with wasn't the shock or the revelation for me. I already knew that. It's just the sensitivity with which she does it, the open love of talking about these creatures. It's a very optimistic, wonderful sort of James Herriot style reading adventure, and my advice to you would be, try not to remind yourself of what almost all the other cows, chickens, and pigs in the world experience. Try to concentrate on what these lucky animals get to live. Just an extremely touching book. And the next one is Unbeaten by Mike Stanton. It's another biography. It's another groundbreaking biography, another biography that is hard for me to see how it could be equaled. Only this time it's of the heavyweight champion boxer, Lucky Luciano, the pride of Massachusetts, who spent his whole career unbeaten, and the author follows him from his childhood and his teenage years all the way through his career, every fight by fight. And despite the fact that last year I loved a big fat biography of Muhammad Ali, I'm not a fan of boxing. I'm not a fan of sports biographies just in general, although maybe I'm going to have to change that. This was wonderful. It's just another example of what 2018 biographies have been doing for me. They have been showing me all kinds of aspects of the genre, my favorite genre, that I just wasn't prepared for at all. It's just been an amazingly eye-opening year for biographies, and this is a perfect example. Again, if you had told me a year ago that a biography of Lucky Luciano would be one of my favorite biographies of the year, I'd have thought you were crazy. But it's terrific. So again, like with the Bruce Lee book, you don't need to be interested in the subject. You're going to love the book anyway. But if you are interested in boxing, oh my God, or in Lucky Luciano, this is the best book that's ever been written on him, then it's a must. It's an absolute must. Then the next one, another biography. This one, a group biography. It's called Those Wild Wyndhams by Claudia Renton. And it's a big fat book about the 3 young women who are portrayed in one of John Singer Sargent's greatest portraits, the Windham Sisters. And in what I wish was a trend, I wish that we had a whole library of books, each one of which was devoted to a subject of a John Singer Sargent portrait. They all deserve it. They all have fascinating stories, and they all have a ready-made cover illustration. But what it is just the author just goes through the lives of these women and the Britain of their day, for the upper crust where they lived, where they circulated, what they did, what was of interest to them. It should be tedious and somewhat silly stuff when stacked against the unbelievable import of the painting. But instead, it's fascinating, solely due to the narrative abilities of the author. Just she leaves no stone unturned and knows everything about her subjects and their time. So you just keep reading. It was just a wonderful, decadent reading experience. The next one, it is a highlight for June. You're not going to believe it. I scarcely believe it myself. It's A History of Violence by Edward Louis, the author of The End of Eddie. The End of Eddie annoyed me greatly for how maladroit and lead-footed it was. And at first I thought that History of Violence was going to do the same thing, because it's a novel about a horrifying rape experience that the author had. And when I read it the first time, in the advance copy that I got, I felt only irritation. For one reason, something I mentioned on this channel a couple of times, the author's blatant attempts to critic-proof his book. Every single detail in History of Violence, every single detail, streets, cop names, drinks, relative names, rents, movies, to say nothing of the actual events of the tragedy. Every single detail in this book is verifiably true. There is no sense in any way that this is a novel. This is an autobiography. It's an autobiographical account of a particularly horrifying incident in the author's life. And when I first read it, I thought, well, that's just annoying. Why would you do that? Who do you think you're fooling? This is the same thing as The End of Eddie. And then, scenes and stretches stuck with me. And when I got the finished copy, I sat down and read it again. And I changed my thinking in one crucial way. When I started to read it a second time, I said, well, pretend that you didn't see that it's a novel. Pretend that read it as if it were an autobiography. Don't for a minute think about any kind of workshop fads or psychological games or anything. Just read it without the dust jacket. Read it just for what it is. And I was genuinely impressed. It's a tremendously powerful and affecting autobiography. A terrifying thing for the author to write about, and he remembers every detail. And it's arresting. It really is. So it is a June highlight. As a reading experience, it is a June highlight. It is not a novel. I don't know why its publisher called it that. But one way or another, you should read it. Because there are some long stretches of stunningly bald, honest prose in this book. And I'm a little bit surprised at that as well, but there I go. I'm sticking to it. The next one is also autobiography, but at least this one says that it is. It's I Will Be Complete by Glen David Gould, the author of Carter Beats the Devil and Sunnyside. And this is his memoir of growing up, having wacky parents, having odd friends, having school experiences. There's, aside from the fact that the person narrating the story is eventually going to become what I consider to be one of the most talented novelists working today. Aside from that, there really isn't anything extraordinary that happens in it. Certainly nothing that you wouldn't have heard from a friend of a friend in your own life. The key that sets it apart is that, unlike so many novelists who sit down to write memoirs, Glen David Gould decided to bring his novelist toolkit along, much like Edward Louis did, only he calls it what it is. So this thing is every bit as funny and jam-packed and multi-layered and fast-paced as Glen David Gould's novels. He writes it the same way. I've lost count of how many novelists do wonderful narrative jobs with their novels, but when it comes time to write their memoir, they think all of those tools don't matter. Instead, I'm here in my armchair and I'm going to spin tedious stories. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. If you're a spinner of real stories, quote-unquote real stories, you will never be a novelist. You'll be something else, and you'll be good at spinning stories. If you're a novelist, you're good at that, and you should bring those tools to your own memoir. And Glen David Gould does, which made I Will Be Complete is every bit as entertaining and memorable as Carter Beats the Devil. The combination of it and the Edouard Louis almost made me think that we should abolish the distinction. If authors are going to write their autobiographies as novels and write their novels as autobiographies, then one way or another, I highly recommend I Will Be Complete. And then the last June highlight that I want to mention is a children's picture book. It's A Dog Called Doug by Karma Wilson with illustration by Matt Myers. And A Dog Called Doug is about digging. It's Dog, Doug, Dig. It's about a dog named Doug who loves to dig. He loves to dig more than any dog has ever loved to dig, and it is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I highly recommend it to those of you who have kids, those of you who want a very lively book to read at story time. The only caveat that I would offer is the one that I always am sure to offer to people, and when I send kids' books out to kids, I make sure to observe it myself as best I can, which is great children's picture books about dogs almost invariably have a side effect of making the child want a dog of their own. And that's not a good thing to put in a kid's head if that's not on the table for the parents or for the kid. I respect that completely. So I tend not to do it. I tend not to even if I have a great book a kid's book about dogs, and I know people who have young kids, I tend not to send it to them because I don't, or cats, or anything like that, because I don't want to get the kid thinking in that direction. I've seen it happen, and it never comes to good. But if you have a kid and you already have a dog, or more than one, or if, God forbid, you have a dog who digs, oh, what a book. So that's my only caveat there, is that as a kid's book, if your kid doesn't have a dog and you don't plan on getting one, you might not want to read this book to them. But otherwise, you're good to go. And that's it. That is a June highlights from 2018. And if you all like this, I got all sorts of emails and texts and comments about my July TBRBY, as the same kinds of comments I've been getting for 2 years now, of people saying, "Oh my God, my book buying budget and you should never have met. This is worse than homicide. I'm creating huge lists of things to buy. I'm never going to get out of this hole." And if those comments were meant playfully, as I think they were, and if you like this, where I look back at the previous month in addition to forward at the coming month, I'll be happy to do it again. As this was a lot of fun. Wrap-ups are fun, even if mine are incomplete. But anyway, that's it for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.